Good afternoon. Welcome to our show. I'm Melissa Ridgen. It is an election year for the Assembly of First Nations. Two-term leader Perry Bellegarde is not running, leaving it wide open for a new leader and some fresh vision. But is fresh vision even possible in what's widely known as an old boys club? Today we are putting the AFN in focus. How far has it come? Where does it need to go? We've got great guests to chew the fat on this topic. APTN executive producer Paul Barnsley, who's spent 3 decades covering Indian country and the AFN. Doreen Manuel and Sheila North will join us. We'll be talking about the increasing calls for the AFN to be led by a woman and be an advocacy group for the grassroots, not just a boardroom of good old boys enjoying their travel and per diems like business fat cats. And later in the show, APTN's Brett Forrester, who broke story this week about the National Chief's wife getting AFN contracts, latest eyebrow-raising thing after a few scandals in recent years, and we're going to get into all of that. And I'm happy to not be here alone today. APTN producer Bruce Spence joins me to co-host. He's one of my go-tos when I want intel and insight into political organizations and movements. It's a call-in show, of course. If you've got something you want to say about the AFN, you can give us a shout toll-free, 1-877-647-2786. Well, before I introduce you to our guests, let's take a look back at a story from the APTN Vault as Tim Fontaine explains, what does the AFN do?
The Assembly of First Nations is a political organization representing First Nations communities from coast to coast. The modern Assembly of First Nations was born as the National Indian Brotherhood in the 1960s. That group rose to prominence in 1969 when it organized nationally to fight against the White Paper, a policy that was proposed by then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. The White Paper would have abolished all treaties and rights. The feds eventually backed down, but the National Indian Brotherhood was here to stay. By the 1980s, the group changed its name to the Assembly of First Nations. Since then, the AFN has emerged as arguably the most vocal, visible, and influential First Nations political entity in the country. So how does it work? The group is headed by the National Chief, who is typically elected every 3 years. The AFN also has an executive committee made up of 10 regional chiefs from across the country. The National Chief and the Executive Committee get their marching orders in the form of resolutions that are tabled and voted on during 2 assemblies each year, usually. But while it sounds like the AFN is a government, it is not. It may be modeled on the United Nations General Assembly, but the Assembly of First Nations is a lobby group for chiefs, and only chiefs can vote for National Chief, who is not actually a chief, but a national spokesperson. Even the AFN's charter states that, quote, the National Chief shall have no inherent political power, unquote. Any political power is supposed to be held by the over 630 chiefs that make up the AFN.
Well, let's stay in the time machine for a little bit. Back at the last General Assembly back in 2018, where Perry Bellegarde was elected to a second term.
The results are in from the first ballot, and the Chief Electoral Officer announced the results from the stage.
Catherine Whitecloud, 19. Miles Richardson, 87. Sheila North, 106. Russ Diabo, 4040. Perry Bellegarde, 286.
Perry Bellegarde had instant reaction to the results. In total, 538 people voted, with 548 people actually registered to vote, including Kel Salem from the Squamish Nation.
I'm thinking that it would be really nice if there was a bit of change in the leadership, and we're supporting Sheila North. I think that she's one of the strongest candidates in this election, the strongest candidates we've seen in any AFN National Chief election. But I think it remains to be seen how the results come out.
Sheila North was gathered with her supporters in the crowd as the results were read.
It's what we predicted, but it's second ballot that we're going to see a big movement, so we're still in the game.
As the candidate with the fewest votes, Catherine Whitecloud was eliminated and wished her fellow nominees the best of luck in a heartfelt speech.
I gave you my heart, and you made a decision, and I respect that.
With none of the candidates reaching the 60% threshold, we'll be moving into the second ballot shortly. Please stay tuned to aptnnews.ca for live stream coverage, as well as our social media sites. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
That, of course, was the big production back in 2018. And with another election looming this summer, let's discuss where the AFN has been, its victories, its shortcomings, and where the advocacy organization needs to go from here. Joining Bruce Spence and I is Paul Barnsley, executive producer of APTN Investigates. Ryerson Review of Journalism calls him, quote, one of Canada's best Indigenous affairs investigative reporters. He won the Journalists for Human Rights Annual Lifetime Achievement Award back in 2016 for his work in Indian country. And before APTN, Paul was the national editor and senior reporter at Windspeaker. That was back in the mid-90s. And before that, he was a reporter at Six Nations. Paul, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Melissa.
Well, you've been around for a long time. How many AFNs have you covered? How many national chiefs have circled through in your career?
Oh, I should have done the math on that. Let me think. I wrote about the national chief election in 1994. So 94, 97, 2000, a bunch.
A bunch.
Ovid Mercury won in 94. And then the first one I attended was in 97 in Vancouver, and that's when Phil Fontaine upset, some would say, Ovid Mercury, his fellow Manitoban. And that was the first of 3 terms as national chief that Phil served. He was interrupted after his first term by Matthew Kunkam, a James Bay Cree candidate. And Matthew served 1 term, and then Phil had 2 more. Since then, we've had Sean Atleo and Perry Bellegarde. I think I've got them all. Yeah, I have got them all.
You know, there was never any shortage of fireworks at these things either. Hey, I mean, it's kind of a spectacle that Indigenous journalists look forward to going and getting to cover. I would ask Bruce, and then I'm going to ask Paul as well. What's changed the most, I guess? Just, you know, broad strokes of AFN. Either you could call it an evolution of AFN, maybe others would call it a devolution of AFN. What kind of stands out for you?
You ask tough questions, Melissa. I can't see anything really changing much at the AFN level. If anything, there would be able to get something done, like an apology from the Harper government for residential schools, and I understand now there's been a significant funding increase.
Like record amount of funding that they're getting now, right?
Going to the organization in the last budget. But in terms of seeing what's out on the street, not much has changed, and in fact I would put it out there that things have actually gotten worse for the common Indigenous treaty status. Your average Joe and Jane on the streets are no better off than they were a few years ago.
Decades ago. Paul, is there anything that, you know, in the years that you've been covering, you know, 3 decades, is there any interesting growth of AFN that just kind of stands out from you from a reporter's perspective?
Growth is an interesting word. It's funny, back when Phil Fontaine was national chief, a young researcher named Russ Dybo wrote a paper noting that national chiefs that are more amenable to the federal government agenda tend to see their funding go up rather dramatically. And then when Matthew Kunkam said some things that outraged the federal government, his funding went down, and that has continued. You hear the term off and on of the super band office, and the idea being that AFN seeks out a lot of funding and gets it and creates a lot of jobs, and hopefully some of those jobs produce something of lasting good, although I couldn't testify under oath that has happened all that often. The pendulum swings back and forth. And right now, I think Perry Bellegarde is rivaling Phil Fontaine for the amount of money they're bringing into the organization. The big fight back in the late 90s and the early aughts, if that's the word, was over the First Nation Governance Act, and that did change the organization a bit, because suddenly now you had BC chiefs, more or less, well, not unified, because the interior chiefs and the coastal chiefs always have a different look at things. But there was enough of the First Nation summit chiefs supporting the government's agenda. They weren't overly concerned with treaty issues, because when the treaty commissioners were crossing Canada back in the 1800s, they came up against the Rocky Mountains and they took a look up and went, nah, let's go home. So there are no treaties in BC. So that's always been a split in the country. Ontario's the second largest bloc, so it's always been a BC-Ontario split. And it's always been a treaty, more, well, the word's been used, modern institutions. I guess you could say more Eurocentric institutions. And that's been the fight ever since the Governance Act. I'd say it's still going on. I don't follow the AFN as closely as I did, obviously, when I was covering them full time. But that's really the only significant change I've noticed. It's still very much, the case can be made that it's a lobby group for chiefs, and the grassroots people's issues are not a huge part of the mix, although the chiefs would argue differently and say they represent their people.
You know, it would be interesting.
But I know we get emails and phone calls and letters every day.
That connection between that connection between cabinet and the AFN national chief and a couple of the higher ranking cronies, always something that's under the radar, but it's always there.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned the First Nations Governance Act, and what I recall from that is empty chairs in every meeting room. Fast forward to the United Nations Declaration, which is being touted by Bellegarde, but nobody else seems to like it in the country. What's that connection there? What goes on at the cabinet table with the likes of Michael Wernick at the Privy Council and the big chiefs with their big giant headdresses? What happens behind there where they plan this stuff out? I think there's always been a connection there somehow, but how big a connection, I don't know. I've never been behind those doors.
Paul, do you know?
It's yeah, they let me in there, and I said, no. That's one of the big problems with the AFN. If they don't want you to know, you're not going to find out. You can guess, you can get some stuff leaked, but the stuff that's leaked is generally at least a little bit suspect. You can only guess, and it does seem, on looking at long-range patterns, that the federal government really needs somebody to make a deal with, and they've decided the AFN ticks all their boxes. And the AFN it's not a rights-holding organization. That's the nations that hold the rights. It's not a government, although the national chief gets treated like the First Nation prime minister. But cabinet needs somebody to make a deal with as they try to solve, quote unquote, their Indian problem.
Exactly.
And the AFN plays that role, yeah. And I'm not impugning the character of any of the leaders. It's a tightrope to walk it. And all of them have made very positive contributions to the rights picture. But man, there's a certain political reality that stalks the hallways of power. It's a complicated job. I'm not about to judge anybody for how they do it. Did I answer your question, Melissa?
You did, and I actually had a follow-up question to that, but we have a caller right now, so I will make a mental note to revisit it. We have Bruce on the line. Bruce 2.0 is joining us on the phone.
Hello.
Hey, what did you want to add to the conversation?
Well, I understand the AFN is important, and I understand they're funded by the federal government. I don't know their budget, but I'd like to know what their mandate is. I try and search information on the internet about them, but nothing is available. Just wondering why or how can we receive information about them.
Bruce, I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, that alone, the question alone speaks volumes. I mean, if people are wondering, you know, what's the AFN do? How much money do they get? What is the money spent on? And you have trouble figuring that out. I mean, AFN's not doing well in the comms department, I guess.
Bruce asks a very interesting question, and
comes with the name, right?
Yes. If you go to afn.ca, there is some links there that will tell you what their mandate is, what the AFN thinks their mandate is. It sets out their charter, and I can't quote it in detail like Paul does, but a lot of that stuff is in there. As for the budget that they've got, couldn't tell you.
Well, I know that they've secured, like, it's double-digit billions of dollars, right?
$27 billion this time. And I think back in the day, you know, it was 20. Couldn't tell you. Couldn't tell you.
Paul, where does it go?
It goes to a variety of people who are hired to design and deliver programs. There's controversy over that too. That's the super band office thing again.
I would hope there would be.
Because all the chiefs would rather have the money go right to them, you know, but it goes to Ottawa instead. And yeah, that's one of the controversies, no doubt about that. But the national chief can get a lot of his power from being able to, you know, dangle the possibility of employment in really good paying jobs to people who support him or her, although there's never been a her.
Yeah.
And that's all part of the process. So it's a good thing from the national chief's perspective to get more and more funding. They can certainly do things that benefit themselves when the numbers go up.
This is kind of one of the things that infuriates me in all of this is you look at how much money is spent in the Indian Affairs Department and versus, you know, $1. Paul, you and I have had a gazillion conversations about this, how $1 from there, if you were to follow that dollar, how many pennies get to the actual people on the ground, you know, a First Nations person. It would be out of that dollar pennies. And I guess the same people could have the exact same criticism about the AFN. There's $27 billion and how, you know, we still have abject poverty. We have a whole bunch of issues that have never been solved despite all of this money being thrown at it. I wanted to go to a clip here. We have two previous national candidates chiefs. We're going to watch these clips and then we'll come back and chew on what they had to say.
Well, I have lots of support from the people, you know, the grassroots. I have some support from the chiefs. I don't know if I have the 60% needed to win. That's what I have to try and convince the majority of the chiefs here, that they need to choose between Ottawa or the people. You know, I represent the people and the land in my approach. The rest of them are really, like I said, status quo.
AFN is missing spiritual leadership, and that's what our elders say, because when you're not grounded in your language and you're not attached to the land, and when you're not grounded in who you are as a person, then your leadership, your vision is missing, and we don't have a clear, powerful vision to lead us forward like our ancestors of old did, that we could look back to.
You know, both Russ and Catherine summarize what we hear a lot from a lot of different people. Paul, I'll ask you, you know, if you could whisper in the ear of any potential national candidate chiefs thinking about running in this next election, you know, what advice would you have for them?
Well, let's assume that the ultimate goal is to win the election. I could offer advice on all sorts of other things, but to win the election, you have to bring together the now warring parties is not a delicate term, but the differing parties, the treaties versus not the treaties. And I have to pay many respects to Phil Fontaine. I thought he did that masterfully. That's why he got 3 terms. He found a way to somehow get everybody pointed in the same direction, and it's no easy thing to do, and it shouldn't be an easy thing to do. Every individual nation or First Nation obviously is its own entity with its own dreams and aspirations. But as a national organization, you have to be a master politician to get the organization to any kind of consensus at any time. And in my time, the best at that was Phil Fontaine. He did it. Like, it used to shock me how effective he was at these assemblies, because there's always so much political intrigue going on behind the scenes. The place to be, you cover these chiefs' assemblies, is out in the corridors or in the back room somewhere.
I remember you saying that.
A lot of the stuff that happens on the floor, I know for a fact. Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I know there were some chiefs who were or some elders who were told, get out there and start talking. We got to get into a back room somewhere and bash out a deal, and you just keep talking until we come back. And that in itself is an art form, believe me.
Well, Paul, we thank you for taking the time to chew the fat with us.
It's a fascinating thing to cover.
We've got to take a break. When we come back,
pleasure.
We've got Doreen Manuel and Sheila North who are joining us about smashing the patriarchy, the need to get grassroots back involved at the AFN. Stay with us.
Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
Well, let's go to social media now with our social media editor, Jesse Andrushko, to hear what some of you are saying about the AFN.
Thanks, Melissa. We had some interesting comments online from our audience about the AFN and Perry Bellegarde. Let's take a look. First on Facebook from Gloria. I've been learning about him more and more. For all those who disagree and argue on the integrity of the man, let's hear the options these people have to correct the issues at hand. Until there is a true meeting of the minds for our Earth's future, we will walk in darkness, earning nothing to brag about. Sandy said, AFN should fold. They only represent the chiefs, not the people, and a majority of chiefs are corrupt. Janice commented, I don't know how those AFN guys sleep at night in their fancy houses. From Lorraine, need someone true and honest, someone who does not change at the first sight of his check. Liza said, we need clan mothers. Lastly, on Twitter from Norix, Indigenous people should have their own governing council over the federal colonial government. That council has final say over legislation, not the Senate. Thank you to everyone that commented. If you want to share your thoughts on the AFN or Perry Bellegarde, here's how. Join our conversation now. Call in toll-free at 1-877-647-2786. Like us on Facebook on our APTN News page. Follow or tweet us at APTN InFocus. And send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca.
For that, Jesse. Well, the lack of interest in the AFN certainly can be felt in some of those comments. And, you know, just more broadly, as we were talking about before the break, there's, you know, lots of grassroots people are saying this has nothing to do with me. We've got perfect guests joining us to discuss. Doreen Manuel, she's a filmmaker and a teacher. Her dad, George Manuel, you know from the National Indian Brotherhood that laid the foundation here for the AFN. And joining us too, Sheila North. She was a national chief candidate back in 2018, who campaigned on getting women involved, but also getting back the AFN back to the basics, working for the grassroots. Sheila has announced that she's running for the Grand Chief with the AMC here in Manitoba, the Manitoba Chiefs Association. Thank you, ladies, both for joining us as we chat today. Chew the fat, as we keep saying, on the AFN, where it's been, where it is, and where it needs to go. Doreen, I'll start with you. If your dad was alive today, what would his thoughts be on what the AFN has or hasn't accomplished or become?
Well, the AFN has become, in its own words, an advocacy organization. What George Manuel worked with back in when he became national chief, August 20th of 1970, he was working with a lobbying organization. That's what they were building. And his first mandate was to set up a steering committee to deal with ministerial issues specific to negotiate with the government on Indian rights and treaty rights, which today you would know as Aboriginal title and rights. And, you know, they were true to that fight and that battle. One of the quotes that's in my latest film, Unceded Chiefs, he says, expand the powers that you have, so as we can control our fishing rights, so as we can control our hunting rights, so as we can control education, so as we can control our whole destiny through our political initiatives. Now listen to that. Expand the powers that you have. You have today. You, I, everybody listening, we have powers. We have the power to shut Canada down and force them back to the negotiation table. What we need is an organization who is willing to step up to the plate and be that original lobbying organization and be clear about the things that we need as a people. Because when you continue to look on the AFN website and you go to the section called policy sections, you have a long list of what I call, there's social issues that are happening in our community and they're vitally important. But AFN does not have to be lobbying for them. We have organizations to lobby for health and all of the other. And in the last 39 years, the AFN hasn't made much progress with those advocacy issues. They need to find a different system to let the organizations that already exist deal with those things, and they need to get back to what's important, Aboriginal title and rights.
I love that point, getting back to Aboriginal title and rights. But I guess, you know, if your goal is to be who can get the most money from Canada, you know, maybe that's the problem.
I think, Doreen, pleased to meet you. I think your dad had it right. Expand the powers that you have. The AFN does not do that anymore. Back in those days when the '69 white paper was out there and everybody came together, it was the people from British Columbia that, in my view, were the most scary. They sang louder, they danced harder. They brought all of that cultural aspect of the powers that they have into those meeting rooms in Ottawa, whether it was by train or plane or automobile. They got there, and that radicalism is not there anymore. You know, there's a saying that the revolution will not be funded. There was a revolution happening back there, and I think what came along in the years subsequent to George's leadership was that the money increased the way Paul described. When you start to fall in line with government policy, the more you did that, the more money you got, and that unfortunately removed the mandate of the powers that you have to expand on. It just totally overwhelmed it, and I would like to see that come back.
Sheila, you know, you campaigned back in 2018, you know, on much of what we're talking about here. You know, is it unfixable, I guess? Like, once you're in power, is it impossible to do the things that Doreen and Bruce just laid out?
Well, in the current system, I would say it would be very, very difficult. And just to clarify, you know, when I ran in 2018, I didn't run because I was a woman. I ran because I was asked, and I felt like I could make good contributions based on the things that I've learned growing up in the North, but also as a journalist, and also my relationships with leadership. So those are the things that I ran on, and those are the things that I believe that any organization, building bridges, having clear communication, and being open to, you know, new partnerships is imperative. And in the current way that the AFN is set up, historically, of course, it was initially like INAC, set up by the federal government. So that's why we have problems. It's controlled still at the end of the day by the federal government, no matter how much money is delivered or sent to AFN for distribution or any other organization. And I'm not trying to be critical to any of those organizations, but the fact is that the federal government is way too involved in our day-to-day lives still to this day, and that's a big hindrance for us. We have the ability to run our own affairs. We have sovereign nations. We have lots of great people in our midst who can run our own affairs, and we should be able to do that now. And I feel like this pandemic has shown us that anything is possible. We can reset relationships, because everything that we've seen up till now, including the pandemic, we've known that the federal government and provincial governments are not doing enough to make sure that our people are healthy and happy, and we can do that ourselves.
You know, there are calls, people say AFN should be completely, you know, shriveled up in a little ball and pitched in the bin because of it's taking all this money and it's not doing anything to help actual people in their lives. on the ground. Other people say, you know, this is just the federal government. Canada uses the AFN as a little box to check, which is what Paul Barnsley had said earlier in the show. This is us. Oh, look, we've dealt with the Indians, right? We've checked that box. We can move on. Doreen, should it just be scrapped? Like you were talking about those other organizations, is there a way that we could get better results if more hands were doing the work and AFN was out of the picture?
Yes, I think that what we should be actually fighting for, and I've thought this like ever since I was a teenager, we need to be fighting for a different way of getting paid from the government. What they owe us is back taxes on our land. So there should be a more equitable funding formula for paying us for that, not what they're using right now, because everybody knows education funding and all of these fundings are based on a per capita formula that doesn't work for us. It doesn't provide enough education, housing, and all of the other services that we need. We should be collecting a flat percentage rate from all federal provincial funds raised through taxation, resource extraction, Crown land leases, and every fund that they collect through our territories, they should be paying us a flat rate, a percentage rate from those fees, and that should be retroactive from when those industries started up in our territories. And these funds should be monitored and paid out from our own people, from our own governing board. And they should not be considered government funding, but rather land resource usage payments.
Love that.
Like an Indian taxation payment. And if we were getting that kind of money, you know, when you walk out the door and you look around at the roads, the light poles, the sewer systems, the water systems, everything that's in place in every single place across Canada, we pay for that out of our money.
Yeah.
So why is it when we go onto the reservation, it's substandard? It shouldn't be. Because the municipalities are getting a formula percentage of all of that money, we should also be getting an even more, a greater amount, so that we can build those. Does the AFN have to curl up and die? I don't know. Because I'd like to see that. Maybe reorganize.
I was going to say that sentiment is very much was felt across the country when I ran for AFN, and I think that's where we're moving to, even though it feels like it's going at a snail's pace. I believe we're in a moment of time where that's actually happening, and I feel that AFN and AMC and all the PTOs across Canada, they do have a role to play in our country and in our lives, and I think that that relationship we've had with them and our organizations is transforming naturally and organically, and it should. It's not the same as it was 30 years ago. Now we have to honor the sovereignty of our First Nations, first of all, and then follow that lead. And I believe that's what it was supposed to be maybe in the past, but I think more so that's needed now.
What would you do to expand that growth you're talking about, Sheila? I mean, to me, it looks like the AFN has become so complacent over the years that they don't do anything. How would you change that? Because they're comfortable. The Chiefs are very comfortable with their trips to Ottawa. Well, maybe not so much with the pandemic, but they're very comfortable with the way things are right now. In that sense, they are conservative. What would you do to shake that up? I know you're running regionally. You've run nationally. You've seen a lot of this stuff going on. What would you do to make things different?
Well, Bruce, I think there's a lot of misconceptions of what chiefs are comfortable with, I have to say, because I was Grand Chief of Northern Manitoba, and I can't say that any chief that I've ever worked with was super comfortable and just, you know, living on the laurels of whatever, traveling back and forth to Ottawa. I don't think that's it at all. They have a lot of pressures. And I think that, you know, public perception is part of the problem. We don't actually know what it entails to be a chief or to be in any of these positions, because all we hear from the greater public is that they're spending a lot of money, we're spending a lot of money. And I think that also has to change. And I believe that when public understands, including our own Indigenous people, understand what the work actually entails, then I think that better off we'll be going forward. I know in one community here in Manitoba, they have about 1,000 people, but they only have resources every year for about half of that, maybe even a third. And what are chiefs and communities supposed to do to keep their families safe, happy, not thinking about suicide, all those things? So we have to keep in mind what they're up against, no matter what it seems like that they're living lofty. I
hear what you're saying, Sheila, but at the same time, you heard the comments that were being made from the Facebook, from the social media. You know, there's a lot of people that don't see any results, and they see the organization as flat. And I can understand some of the problems that the Northern Chiefs have with the way things are up there. But the end result is there are more of our people going murdered and missing. There are more of our people committing suicide. Our jails are getting fuller and fuller, and it goes on and on and on. What would you do to change that?
Again, a lot of it is perception that the chiefs don't care or that organizations don't care.
Well, maybe whether they care or not, they have. I'm sorry, Sheila, I don't mean to cut you off. Whether they care or not, the result is the same, and there needs to be some change. And I'm asking you again, what would you do to make that change?
That's why we need to negotiate better and forge new relationships with the federal and provincial governments, like including getting rid of the NRTA and perhaps even the Indian Act. Maybe not get rid of it in its form, but also transform it and reset the relationship. I think that we have a lot of opportunity. We have great negotiators amongst us. We have great lawyers of Indigenous lawyers that can do all these things. And I think it's high time we do it. A lot of it is that relationship that the federal government has set out. They call the shots, unfortunately, in a lot of situations. And at the end of the day, if they don't like what a First Nation is doing, they have the power to yank funding if they want to. And that is always looming on people's heads. And, you know, as long as the federal government has the last say, we're going to keep having these problems.
I want to hear Doreen's thoughts on this.
I want to caution people against being blackmailed like that. Because I have worked for a band. I stood beside my brothers each time when they were chiefs. I was in Ottawa with my dad when he was national chief. And you do have power. You don't have to adhere to all of the social services policy to the exact letter and the education policies. I was an education coordinator. I know how you can stretch those to serve your people better. I was a fundraiser. I brought millions of dollars into my band every single year because I learned how to lobby for funding to help my band increase their revenues. There's ways to work within that system to do a better job that is being done to serve our people better on our communities. And also, I don't want people to feel like there's a gun to their head. You know, back in the 70s, my band rejected funding. Flat out sent it back, said, don't bother with us. We lived great. We had hunting parties out, we had gardens out, we supported ourselves. And we put the government in the position of being afraid of us, because if one little Indian group in all of Canada can do that, we're setting an example to help people understand how much power they have. Expand the powers that you have.
Get radical. We've got a caller here and she has a question. Josie?
Yes.
Josie, thanks for calling. What was your question?
Yes, with the $27 billion that has been given to AFN from the federal government, I'm at a loss to understand why there isn't clean water on all of the reserves across Canada.
Everybody's nodding, going, we want to know too, Josie. Who wants to take a stab at that? I mean, it's absurd when you think about the amount of money that goes into doing nothing. Why isn't there like the revolt? Why isn't there the revolution? Why isn't there the radicalism standing up going, I won't say that word because it's 2:00. I almost said it. Doreen, I'll go back to you if you want to take a stab.
Well, first I want to give a comparison. I want people to know that I have my father's journals. This is a tiny little one, but I have his journals that he kept through his whole political career.
People would pay a lot of money to want to sit down with those for an hour or so.
In 1970, when he took over the position, the government had promised $1.7 million to Indigenous organizations. That's not just the National Indian Brotherhood, that's Indigenous organizations across Canada. One of the things he was tasked with was forcing the government to actually give them the money. And he did that. So I'm just like, 1.7 million, billions of dollars, and nothing's being done. I just wanted to put an exclamation point on that.
Yeah, I like that. Sheila, I would ask you, you're going to be running, you want to be Grand Chief at AMC. We, of course, wish you luck in that. If there was one person you could work with at AFN, leading AFN, who would it be?
Well, I can't answer that.
Come on! win?
I don't know, but I'm not going to weigh in because
do you
I know
have a
I'd like
list?
to be a candidate. Of course I do in my head, and I have a wish list. But yeah, it is a tough decision to run. It's not an easy decision, and I was contemplating running again for AFN this year, but you know, so many things have come to play in the last year, including this pandemic and the impact it has on my own personal family, and I have to be here for them while I'm doing the work that I need to do for our people. Because I've been asked. So I'm looking forward to whatever the results will be, though.
Well, we thank you guys for taking the time to join us. I could honestly talk to both of you for the rest of the afternoon between you and Bruce and getting some good callers in here. So thank you, Merci. We, I believe, have to take another break, or do we have time to go? Okay, so far what we know, Alvin Fiddler, Kevin Hart, those are the people saying that they're going to run for national chief, correct? Of course, the calls for, and there's dozens of names that are out there, the calls for the next leader to be a woman to kind of change the shape, the direction of AFN. Lots of female names out there too, including former MMIWG National Inquiry Commissioner Michelle Audette. She is at the Echequan Commission hearings right now in Quebec. APTN's Lindsay Richardson caught up with her to just ask her outright.
Yes, I was approached a long time ago, or I was asked if I would consider. I was honored, to be honest, but there's other people that will do an amazing work or amazing job, and not for me.
Well, there you have it. It's not going to be Michelle. And actually, right before the show started, I was telling Bruce I had a message from somebody about a candidate who is going to be announcing, I believe, tomorrow, and it is a woman. And that's all we can tell you. But now you got to tune back. You got to tune into APTN National News tomorrow, and hopefully we have all of that for you. But right now, we have to take another break. When we come back, APTN's Brett Forrester is going to join us to talk about some of the most recent AFN scandals and also what's expected this summer at the Assembly. Stay with us. Welcome back. The Assembly of First Nations will elect a new national chief in July. Current chief Perry Bellegarde, of course, has said he is not seeking re-election. Anishinaabe Nation Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler and Manitoba Regional AFN Chief Kevin Hart have said that they're running. The election is going to be held virtually. But as Jamie Pashagumskum reports, some actually want the whole thing postponed.
Mary-Ellen Turpel-Lafont is a former Saskatchewan judge. She says an election during the pandemic is not appropriate.
Which, is really painful. It's a really painful time for people people have stopped having ceremonies. They've stopped connecting for public safety reasons. And we're not in a mindset to be able to meet and discuss things fully at this time. And I think by fall and winter, we could be in a much better position to be able to do that.
Turpel-Lafont wrote a letter to the AFN Executive Committee to delay it until next December, but it will go through as planned. But Turpel-Lafont sees a downside. As I say in my letter,
to put it bluntly, the most likely outcome of following through with the current virtual election plan is an election that's less democratic, less fair, less accessible, and it will result in a weakened ability for the AFN to represent and advocate for First Nation. We could very much get a result where someone's elected and very quickly removed.
Turpel-Lafont points out that there has never been a female national chief. No women have declared an intention to run yet, but Turpel-Lafont says the COVID pandemic could have something to do with it.
And I found that Indigenous women and First Nations women were 4 to 5 times more likely to get a confirmed diagnosis of COVID, and we're bearing the biggest burden of caring for people with COVID and managing safety in their community. So not only is this virtual election coming in a way that does not accommodate accessibility, but it doesn't acknowledge the position of women.
Sheila North is a former regional Grand Chief in Manitoba, and she was asked to run for National Chief.
I have to be closer to home to be part of the healing process and going forward with my community and with my family. So that's one of the biggest reasons why I decided to stay in Manitoba.
APTN News reached out to the AFN for comment on their decision to proceed, but didn't hear back as we went to air. The nomination period for National Chief ends June 2nd, with the elections taking place on July 7th. Jamie Pashagamskam, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Such a good point to make because, of course, during the pandemic, it is always the women who end up bearing the brunt, at home on the home life of or home front of this. So this isn't the only AFN news that we have for you about postponing or not postponing, or should women run or not run, or who's winning or who's not. APTN recently reported the organization issued contracts to a business based out of a home owned by the National Chief and his spouse in Ottawa. Here to discuss this is the reporter behind that exclusive story, Brett Forrester.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
We always love having you on, Brett. Fountain of information. So, you've been kept busy in recent months with a lot of turmoil at AFN. We know a lot of grassroots people pay absolutely no attention to anything that the AFN is up to. They've just disengaged for a long time. We've been mulling the many reasons for that. But for those people who have disengaged that might be watching now because they want to know what the conversation is going forward, can you give us a little bit of a rundown on some of the troubles AFN has been going through recently?
I certainly can, and I'll try to keep it brief. I think the best
you need your
place,
own show for this, the whole hour.
Would be to start at the beginning of this particular round of troubles. This would be in December 2020 during the annual General Assembly of the AFN Chiefs. The delegates were debating a resolution about whether or not to conduct an independent investigative review into gender and sexual orientation-based harassment at the AFN, and the tension or the turmoil at the executive level seeped into public during this debate as the Ontario Regional Chief, Roseanne Archibald, accused National Chief Perry Bellegarde of obstructing passage of this motion. At the time, the Chiefs were trying to kind of water down the language, dull its edge a little bit. But after Archibald called out Bellegarde, they reverted and they decided to pass the motion without any amendments. So that's investigation 1. Investigation 2 happened in February, so fast forward a few months. The Chiefs of Ontario, keeping up with this push for transparency and accountability, passed a resolution calling for an independent review of financial matters at the AFN, whether it's contract or conflicts of interest and other things like that. So that's investigation 2. Now let's go forward to investigation 3. As APTN broke the story of this resolution, the AFN announced it would be proceeding with a full investigation into harassment allegations that were lodged against Regional Chief Roseanne Archibald. And so that was almost at the same time. So that's investigation 3. And a little while after that, they announced that they were opening yet another investigation into allegations of a data breach within the AFN executive. And now shortly after that, the Chiefs voted down a motion to implement the COO resolution. So now we're back to 3 investigations. And then it was after that that APTN broke the story about the contracts that were awarded to a company operated out of the home of the National Chief.
So you've been slightly busy in the past couple of minutes. And I love that you just so succinctly pulled that all in for people who haven't been following it necessarily. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but I did want to ask you, you're going to be covering this election this summer. What do you expect will be what do you expect to see? We'll just leave it wide open.
I'll be looking for 3 things. I'll be looking to see if this tension starts to seep again into the public. It's important not to miss the forest for the trees. These power struggles are happening over the future direction of the AFN and what its mandate is going to be in the future. So that's the first thing I'm looking for. The second thing I'll be looking for is what that mandate looks like when a new national chief is in fact declared. Is it going to be a push for transparency transparency, accountability, and internal change. You know, there's a lot of solutions out there, a lot of suggestions about ways the AFN can reform itself and make itself more democratic and make itself more accountable to First Nations people. As the previous guest noted, the AFN is not a government. It acts like a government. It looks like a government. It draws on First Nations governance systems, but it's not a government, and that's an important thing to note. So I'll be watching for the mandate.
All I want to know, Brett, is how much was that contract awarded to Perry Bellegarde's house?
We don't have time. We don't have time. We're 30 minutes to black here, so I'm going to have to shut you down. Brett, thank you so much for joining us. We always love having you on. We're all out of time. Thank you to our guests for sharing their perspective and insight. We love these conversations. We are at the end of our show. Thank you, Bruce, for co-hosting with me. Always nice to have you here as well. I'm Melissa Ridgen. We'll be back here next week with your season finale of APTN InFocus. It'll be a good, nice, light show for you. Getting back the movement to get back to traditional weddings. Lots of great things happening. We'll see you next week. Take care.